Hey everyone, I'm Andrew J. Clark, a landscape and astrophotographer from Western Australia, and in this video I'm going to be sharing with you some initial test results and sample images shooting astrophotography on the A7 Mark IV. I'll be comparing it with the A7 III for noise performance and image quality generally, and also checking out whether the A7 IV has a second native ISO. It does, and whether it displays ISO invariant behavior. It does that too. As with my last video on the A7 Mark IV for landscape photography, which you can find a link to right here, a quick disclosure. I am sponsored by Sony Australia and they lent me the A7 IV for the purpose of preparing for some events which we ran together a few weeks ago. However, I don't get to keep the camera. In fact, I've already sent it back. Sony does not have any input into the content of this video and doesn't get to review it before I post it, and no one's paying me to make it. Another important thing to note with these tests is that all of the test images were shot on a pre-production version of the A7 IV. And while I did get to update it to firmware 1.0, which is presumably going to be the launch firmware for the camera, it is possible that these test results would differ slightly from a full production unit. So take these findings with a grain of salt and look out for full reviews once the production units come out. However, I found my initial results really interesting and very promising for astrophotography, so I wanted to share them straight away. Okay, some of this stuff is a bit dense, so I've put chapter markers down below if you want to jump to something in particular. And before we get into the dry stuff, here's a sneak peek of some of my favorite astro shots shot on the A7 Mark IV. Let's talk about native ISOs first. Unsurprisingly, the A7 IV has its first native ISO at ISO 100, but when it comes to the second native ISO circuit, which most sonyalpha cameras have, Sony annoyingly doesn't publish data on exactly where it kicks in. But we do know through testing that the A7 Mark III had a second native ISO which kicked in at ISO 640, and the A7S III had a second native ISO kicking in at 1600. Now, just to be super clear, we are talking about the second native ISO in still photography, not in video. And as far as I can tell, as of recording this video, no one has publicly tested the second native ISO in stills on the A7 Mark IV, until now. My tests show that the A7 IV's second native ISO kicks in at ISO 1600, just like the A7S III. This does make some sense because those two cameras do share the same image processor, even though the image sensor is different. But this is perhaps a bit higher than what most of us were expecting, given the A7 III's only kicked in at 640. And it does have implications for how you would shoot certain types of astro shots. I'll come back to that later. Here's a breakdown of my testing methodology. I tested the A7 IV at every ISO from ISO 50 up to ISO 1600, and then every stop above that to 51,200, with the shutter speed and the aperture remaining the same. Long exposure noise reduction and high ISO noise reduction were turned off in camera, and there was no camera corrections or other noise reduction applied in post. Now, these settings do create differently exposed photographs, because the ISO is changing, but the other exposure parameters aren't. But if we then normalize exposure in software by just sliding the exposure slider up or down in Lightroom, for example, we can then zoom in to look at the noise profiles at different levels and check out their performance. Modern Sony sensors usually do display some amount of ISO invariance, meaning that after you normalize in post, the noise actually looks remarkably similar within a certain range or ranges of ISO values. If you want a deeper explanation of what ISO invariance is, how we test it, and why astrophotographers should care, I recommend you check out Alan Wallace's video, which I'll link in the description down below. What we can see from these test results is that noise performance remains very, very similar, i.e. invariant, between ISO 100 and ISO 1250. I ran this test 4 times in different conditions, and every time there was a marked improvement in noise performance when stepping up from ISO 800 to ISO 1600. After this became clear, I went back out and tested all the values in between ISO 800 and 1600 and confirmed that the image clears up considerably when stepping up from ISO 1250 to ISO 1600. When I say noticeably, I mean it's noticeable when you zoom in to say 500%, like on this example. At a normal viewing distance, or even at 100% crop, The differences are at times really hard to discern. But after staring at pictures of noise for literally hours, I'd say I'm 95% confident that the second ISO circuit kicks in at 1600 on the A7 Mark IV. I also reached out to Sony Australia to see if they could confirm my findings, but they just told me they didn't have official information on the specification at this stage. They did, however, confirm that it is indeed the same Bionz XR image processor that we first saw in the A7S III in the A7 IV. Above ISO 1600, we again see ISO invariant behavior for at least a couple of stops, but there was clearly some in-camera processing kicking in at around 12,800 that, yes, reduced the appearance of noise, but also destroyed any semblance of sharpness in the images. At these high ISO values, your dynamic range gets really limited as the sensor becomes unable to protect highlights, as seen here with the ISO 51200 image, which has both blown out highlights as well as very flat tones in the darker areas. Before I move on to my comparison with the A7 III, I just want to reiterate that between my unit being a pre-production unit and the workflow involving me opening the raw files in Sony Imaging Edge and having to convert them to TIFF files before normalizing them in Lightroom, there is a decent amount of imprecision in this testing methodology. If anything changes on the full production unit, you can rest assured I'm going to do a follow-up video on it, so maybe subscribe if you want to see that. Practically speaking though, set your A7 Mark IV to ISO 1600 for best noise performance for most standard Astro shots. Okay, a quick intermission for a photo or two. I took a lot of comparison photos on these two cameras, but in this video, I'll just focus on the test results at each camera's respective native ISOs, which again is 640 on the A7 III and 1600 on the A7 IV. What we can see is a clear image quality victory for the A7 IV at ISO 1600, and it's not close. It was sharper, more detailed, less noisy, and maybe even a bit brighter on all of my tests. This is also somewhat of a validation of my theory that the second base ISO is 1600 on the A7 IV, because it's just so much better than the A7 III at that value. More interestingly, perhaps, is that at ISO 640, the cameras are fairly evenly matched. In none of my tests at ISO 640 did either camera really dramatically outperform the other. So all things being equal, I'd much prefer to have the A7 IV for its higher resolution. Now you might think off the back of that result that the A7 Mark IV is just going to be a strictly better Astro camera than the A7 III, and that might be true, but there's one question mark that remains, and it relates to dynamic range. Now I can't confirm the dynamic range of these two cameras at this stage, and it's certainly possible that the A7 IIIs may be better at ISO 640. This could end up being very important for things like moonrises or shooting the aurora, where dynamic range can be very, very important. Let's now take a closer look at the thumbnail shot, which is my favorite Astro image captured on the A7 IV to date. The star trails were created by stacking about 130-second exposures, and the foreground was one 16-minute exposure captured at ISO 100. Okay, before I sign off, the two things which are still really annoying me about shooting astrophotography on Sony Alpha cameras, they both relate to the same otherwise excellent feature, which is bright monitoring. It's a setting which slows down the refresh rate of your monitor so that the sensor gets a lot more light and you can generate a pretty decent preview even in completely dark environments. On the A7 Mark IV, you still can only access the bright monitoring feature by assigning it to a custom button. You can't put it in the function menu and you can't put it in your customizable My menu. This is really annoying because I shoot a lot of other genres of photography and I don't want to have a custom button always dedicated to bright monitoring where it could be a far more useful feature that I use more frequently. Secondly, you still can't zoom into the bright preview to achieve focus. When you attempt to zoom in using the focus magnifier to manually focus on stars, it reverts back to the dark preview. So you still have to go through the process of finding one of the brightest stars in the sky and focusing on that. Okay, some quick final thoughts before I sign off for this video. The a7 IV is looking like an exceptionally promising camera for astrophotography. It may even be strictly better than the a7 Mark III, which is very impressive when you consider that the pixel size is going to be smaller because of the higher resolution. I suspect Sony have made some improvements on the image processing side to improve the noise performance of this camera. Between that and the huge incremental improvements we've seen on the Alpha lineup since the a7 III, the whole user experience, the touchscreen, the fully articulating screen, the new menus, all of those features make the a7 IV a very compelling option at this stage, with the one caveat that I did all of my testing on a pre-production unit, so the final version of the camera may produce slightly different results. With all that said, please, if you've got any questions, chuck them in the comments below, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on the prospects of this camera for astrophotography. If you liked the video or found it informative in some respect, I'd appreciate a like. Hit subscribe if you want more content on the a7 IV and other cameras for landscape photography and astrophotography. Hit subscribe and I'll catch you in the next video. Cheers.